we can't socially engineer political evolution or cultural evolution, but I think we can garden for emergence, right? There's a degree of grace, but there's also, being able to see how.
Can you say that phrase again, Steve? We can what for emergence?
Garden for emergence.
Garden for emergence.
Yeah, okay. And it's a new form of life. We can get the soil, we can plant the seed, we can water it, we can make sure there's sun, but ultimately it's up to this new form of life to sprout up. Yeah. And so that's the way evolutionary emergence itself, at least, can be compared to. We're working to help create, to participate in the emergence of the next great stage of cultural evolution, which I think is primed for some kind of synthesis, with progressive postmodernism. I mean, that's its own definition, this worldview beyond modernity. But the progressive postmodern political perspective gains traction gains political will, gains adherence, gains influence in history by pushing off against the abundant accumulating pathologies or negative externalities of modernity, right? So it sort of defines itself in this current of antithesis, right? It rejects, it sort of gets power by pointing out, how fucked up, the Western world is. And there's some legitimate critiques that can be landed and some real threats that need to be addressed. And so I think that this progressive thing we've seen, we can, in my book, Developmental Politics, I trace it back to really the beginning of the Enlightenment with characters like Rousseau. So this kind of countercurrent to modernity is developing for, 200 years, but it really sort of bursts on the scene as its own level of emergence in the 60s. And this kind of countercultural worldview has emerged. And now in America and many parts of the UK and other parts of the developed world, it's become a kind of the new establishment, right? It's kind of taken over many institutions, at least culturally. Politically, it's not quite as successful, but culturally, it's gained major ground, especially since Donald Trump was elected, who in some ways was a kind of a symptom of the growing cultural power of progressivism, but also an accelerant of it. Yeah. And so we're seeing this upward current of the good, which takes the form of an antithesis, a rejection, which moves the ball in important ways. But then I think it's its own accumulating pathologies, right? The sort of the moral exhaustion of the path of rejection. It begins to create the opportunity for a synthesis, right? I mean, Hegel saw it clearly. I mean, I'm not a Hegelian, but still, right? This establishment, Western world that's kind of a truce between the old traditional, religious civilization and the new, secular modernist civilization. That these become the establishment. That's the thesis. The antithesis is a progressive move that paves the way for a synthesis, a political, cultural synthesis. And one of the key characteristics or the methods of this political synthesis is to recognize what you just said. And that is, the team spirit of a soccer team or football team involves both offense and defense, right? It's a polarity. And if that polarity were to become dissociated so that the defense was only concerned about defending and didn't care what the offense was succeeding or not, or indeed was against the offense, then the team's, the goal of the team's clearly undermined, right? So we can begin to see how these polarities that we've been talking about a little bit, in the political realm, we could point to liberty and equality, right? Or grievance and gratitude. Ideally, these are both ways of creating value, but they're interdependent in that their value creating capacity depends on moderation, challenge and support from the other, right? And so one by itself, dissociated from its polar counterpart, becomes quickly pathological, right? Just like we see with progressivism, it's all about grievance and gratitude's nowhere to be found. And so that grievance becomes, but we don't want to just tack back to the right. We're certainly not right wing, and we're horrified by the American right in many ways, right? As I'm sure many of your, but we're also sort of horrified by the left, where we need a more evolved left and a more evolved right if we're going to reclaim a functional democracy. And so part of that is seeing that there's a kind of a prime political polarity, which is that, and it's even can be seen biologically in the sense that, people aren't predetermined this way, but they're born with predilections. And indeed, they can move from one side to the other as they mature in life. But a way of describing these essential predilections is those who are more focused on fixing what's wrong and those who are more concerned about preserving what's right. defense and offense.
Yeah.
And that these two, ideally, that when we understand the way these polarities work, we understand that we even when we have a preferred pole, that our ability to create the value that our pole, I'm oriented toward fixing what's wrong. But I've come to understand that my ability to do that depends on affirming the value of the opposing pole. So affirming the evolutionary necessity of preserving what's right. Where we see the pathology expressed in this fixing what's wrong gone too far is that it wants to burn everything down. Like just in the French Revolution, we're just going to rename the days of the week. We're going to strangle all the priests. I mean, we're going to just wipe away what came before. And that may sound attractive and refreshing, but ultimately we just have to start from this beginning and make all the same mistakes again. So the way evolution itself works, right? Not just in cosmology and biology, but in cultural evolution, there's this structure of emergence that it's transcending and including, right? In the same way that our bodies, you see this pattern of, atoms transcended and included by molecules, molecules transcended and included by cells, cells by complex organisms. That same pattern of transcendence and inclusion occurs in this intersubjective realm of cultural evolution, whereby values cohere in these systems, which we recognize as worldviews, right? The pre-modern worldview, the modern worldview, the postmodern worldview, and this synthetic worldview that we're working to help participate in the emergence of, and define and understand and apply and communicate. So as a think tank, to make it concrete, we're trying to foster or cultivate cultural evolution in America in really in three ways. One is we're recognizing this. We're using this developmental perspective. It's a politics of culture that focuses upstream from the politics of Washington D.C. It recognizes the culture war is a cultural problem, and it's resulted primarily from America growing, right? That is, part of the culture's evolved significantly and part hasn't. And it's become stretched out so that it no longer coheres as a governable entity, which means that these forces that are pulling us apart, that's in a sense, it can be recognized, at least, from a hopeful perspective, as the way evolution works at every level, right? As Herbert Spencer, prior to Darwin, described evolution, as he said, that it's a differentiation followed by integration at a higher level. That's another description of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? So if that's one of the master patterns of the structure of emergence, then we can anticipate that the fullness of the antithesis, right? The political or at least cultural ascendancy of progressivism in the United States, seen over the last 2 years especially, that is that's a sort of a form of cultural evolution that makes the way for a higher level of integration. It's a differentiation, right? We're hyperpolarized, and that can lead to decay, right? Nothing's certain. I mean, the possibility of regression or civil war is in some ways stronger than ever. And yet, I'd also say that these same urgent, problematic life conditions illuminate the need to evolve, and that's part of what we stand for, is what political evolution looks like. And so, again, to be as concrete as I can, that means that people who take this developmental perspective, or what we might even call a post-progressive perspective, it's not anti-progressive. It tries to include all of the important gifts of progressivism, but transcend, to reject the rejection, right? So even Hegel, he didn't use the term thesis, antithesis, synthesis very much. He referred to it as an affirmation, and then a negation, and then negation of the negation. So the synthesis is partially the negation of the negation, not a complete wiping out of the antithesis or the negation, but the constraining of it so that it's not purely rejectionistic, right? So in this new emerging political perspective, we're trying to embody the polarity within ourselves. Even though we may acknowledge that we prefer fixing what's wrong to preserving what's right, we know that our ability to fix what's wrong is interdependent with this other one. And so we're trying to master the polarity, bringing it within ourselves, and thereby creating a synthesis, depolarizing our own thinking such that our larger body politic can move into this less polarized condition. The poles will still be there. There'll still be a right and a left, but there'll be a right and a left that respect each other, sufficiently to engage in the compromises which a democratic system requires.
Yeah, beautifully put. Very similar vision, very similar. And I think what you're talking about is probably what we can hope for as a next step. And I would like to imagine that one day, there's actually a conscious, I really want the Prime Minister on the one side of the House of Commons, when he's being criticized, to go, oh, thank you so much. Yes, no, what you're saying is worth looking out for. Yes, thank you. I'm really pleased you said that. We'll bear that in mind. Not,
sure. Right. Well, they're in a defensive crouch, right?
Because,
where they can't allow any of the
because
other
they don't think they're on the same side. And so what I'm interested in is how we can get to gather together people who have radically different perspectives of what's good, small states, big state, whatever it is, intervention, non-intervention, who recognize they're on the same side. And the reason they're on the same side is they have that same benevolence, not just for their group, but for all, and in the wider sense, which comes from that sense of oneness with humanity, or oneness with nature, and oneness with the universe ultimately. And that then the group thing, which is so big at the moment, of course, becomes your area of responsibility. If I had to have an ethic, if I tried to create an ethic for what I mean by unividual, the closest I can come it would be universal benevolence and individual responsibility. It's like there's a universal, but I'm Tim. So where do I express that? Well, here with my kids, my wife, my friends, my town, my concerns, my things which come up for me. And I can't take on the whole thing. That'd be impossible. And therefore, then the group becomes not the things which shows you're representing this group as opposed to, but actually it becomes the place you express the benevolence.
Sure. Well, and another way of framing that would be the way to manage or work with or practice this integration of polarities. And that's a polarity itself, which is challenge and support. It's a little bit like you might think about parenting.
That's
right?
really nice.
You only want to give unconditional love to your kids, right?
That's really nice.
But you'd be disserving them if you didn't expect things of them and require things of them and challenge them to live up to their potential as moral beings and humans that are trying to make the world a better place. And so this idea of challenge and support is how the kind of indestructible nature of the polarity can be managed in a way that doesn't try to kludge them together. We're not trying to eliminate the tension. We're trying to work with the tension to maximize the value-creating capacity of both poles.
And it's creative, isn't it? I mean, if I look at what we've done just in this conversation, I mean, it's why it's a dialectic. It's a conversation. Right. Has been I think a really enjoyable combination of challenge and support. There's been areas where we've just gone, I completely agree with all of that. Anyway, this area where maybe it's like, because that's where it's creative. But the level of being able to find the place where you're on the same side, like looking for truth, what I love about people who genuinely want to seek wisdom is that they're on the same side as me. Because if they say something better, it's like, yes.
Yeah, it's a spirit, team spirit of team truth.
I was just wrong. And what's more exciting than finding out you've been wrong? I don't think there's anything really.
But so let me say it, just another quick thing, just to kind of define for your listeners, kind of what our program is concretely. So we're trying to create this new political identity or this new political perspective that transcends and include. That there's little common ground left to be found. So we're trying to stake out higher ground, this higher ground where the polarity can be in a container of agreement, of challenge and support. And so that means building this new worldview. So, one of the ways to describe it, in order to change a system, you're not going to get in and try to persuade the people in the system. You're going to create an adjacent alternative system that's more functional and people migrate to that. So that's, job number one. But even within the politics of America as we find them, we despite everything I just said about polarities, we're also recognizing that left and right is no longer that adequate to describe the political landscape, and that from a developmental perspective, we can see at least in America, there's 3 or 4 or 5 major worldview systems, right? The traditional, this modern secular, and then this progressive. And what makes them distinct is that they're each dialectically related to each other, right? That they're each pushing off against each other, even though they interact, even though people may have loyalties to more than one, they're, in history, in the sequence of their emergence, as well as in their interaction in politics, that we could see this dialectic. It's been described by a variety of American commentators as the 4 Americas. right? And so we can see, traditional America, the traditional worldview, the progressive worldview, and then, modernity is kind of being pulled, to one or the other. And so that kind of means that modernity split, and we have these four, the three worldviews can be understood politically, when we put them on the left-right spectrum, even though we discount that concept, we can see these four Americas, they're relating to each other. And we want to help each one of those become more evolved on its own terms. It's not just about getting them all to come up to this higher ground. It's about recognizing that each one of these major ideological positions or worldviews has both dignities and disasters, right? Positive values that we need. They're part of the structure of emergence, that if we were to eliminate, the larger structure would collapse. We need the civilizing influence of traditional values in order for modernity to become, keep it from collapsing into something that's more, raping and pillaging. We need the individual liberties of modernity to kind of take us beyond, the conformism of traditionalism. And then, all of the negative externalities that modernity creates, right? Environmental degradation, gross inequality, et cetera, that we need progressivism to come along as the critique of that and recognize that we need a greater sense of transcendence than modernity delivers. So all of these worldviews, independent of this, emergent synthesis, have ways that we can tease apart the dignities from the disasters. We can make traditionalism more beautiful, true, and good by getting them to vivify their own values more completely and take responsibility for their own pathologies more thoroughly.